The night air in Kandahar province tasted like copper and diesel fuel. Major Elena Blackwood crouched behind the burned-out shell of a Toyota pickup, her M4A1 carbine pressed against her shoulder, the EO Tech holographic sight painting a red dot on the darkness ahead. The temperature had dropped to 95 degrees, almost cold by Afghan standards, but sweat still traced lines through the dust on her face. Viper 6, this is Scorpion 1, she whispered into her radio, her voice steady, despite the chaos erupting around her position. Requesting close air support. Danger, close 200 meters north of my position. We have 12 Marines pinned down in that compound, and we're running out of time. The voice that crackled back was tense. Scorpion 1, be advised, that's extremely close. Wind speed 12 knots from the west. Are you certain? Elena's eyes never left her sight picture. She'd already done the math in her head, the ballistics calculations that separated life from death at 400 meters. Wind drift, temperature altitude, the Coriolis effect that most soldiers never bothered to learn. At 300 feet above sea level, with this crosswind and the ambient temperature, her rounds would drift approximately 8 inches per 10-knot wind at 600 meters. But she wasn't shooting at 600 meters. She was shooting at 380, and the enemy commander was moving toward the building where 12 Marines were bleeding out. Viper 6, I'm certain. I have eyes on target. Danger close is authorized. She squeezed the trigger. The M110 sniper rifle kicked against her shoulder, and 380 meters away, the enemy commander dropped like a puppet with cut strings. One shot, one kill, no hesitation. The Apache gunship came in low, its 30mm chain gun shredding the enemy positions with mathematical precision. Elena was already moving, directing her squad through the compound with hand signals, her commands crisp and economical. Flanking maneuver using the terrain depression to the east. Smoke grenades for cover. Suppressing fire on the western approach. Every decision made in seconds, every calculation weighing lives against probability. That was when the RPG hit their Humvee. The explosion lifted Elena off her feet and slammed her into the compound wall. Shrapnel tore through her left shoulder and thigh, hot metal fragments that felt like being branded with fire. Her ears rang with a high-pitched whine that drowned out everything except her own heartbeat. For 3 seconds, maybe 4, the world tilted sideways and her vision tunneled to a pinpoint. Then training took over. She forced herself upright, her left leg screaming in protest. Blood soaked through her uniform, but she could still move, could still fight. The Marines in that compound couldn't wait for her to recover. They couldn't wait for a medevac or reinforcements or perfect conditions. They needed her now. Scorpion 1 to all units. She barked into her radio, her voice cutting through the static and gunfire. I'm still in command. Continue the assault. Corporal Jenkins, take Alpha Team left. Sergeant Morrison, you're with me on the right flank. Move now. The next 17 minutes existed in a haze of cordite smoke and controlled aggression. Elena directed fire, called in air support, and personally dragged 2 wounded Marines to the extraction point while bullets snapped past her head. Her shoulder was numb by then, her leg a distant throb of agony that she simply refused to acknowledge. There would be time for pain later. There would be time for everything later. When the Blackhawks finally touched down to extract them all, 12 Marines were alive. 4 were wounded, including 1 who wouldn't have lasted another 10 minutes without immediate medical attention. Elena was the last one on the helicopter. Her hand pressed against her shoulder, where blood seeped between her fingers. The flight surgeon took one look at her and started barking orders, but Elena shook her head. Check the Marines first. I can wait. Ma'am, you're losing a lot of blood. I said check the Marines first. That's an order, Corpsman. They pinned the Bronze Star with Valor on her chest 6 weeks later, along with the Purple Heart. The citation mentioned her extraordinary heroism and selfless dedication to the welfare of her Marines. What it didn't mention was the 3 hours of surgery to remove the shrapnel, or the physical therapy that took 4 months, or the nightmares where she still heard the screams of wounded men calling for help. What it especially didn't mention was the scar tissue that would ache in cold weather for the rest of her life, a permanent reminder written in damaged nerves and reconstructed muscle. A reminder that leadership wasn't about speeches or promotions. It was about being willing to bleed so others didn't have to. That was 2019. Elena Blackwood had been 35 years old, a major with a promising career and a reputation for tactical brilliance that made senior officers nervous. Too smart, some said. Too aggressive. Too willing to take risks that made Pentagon bureaucrats uncomfortable. Too female, though nobody said that part out loud. Now, 7 years later, Brigadier General Elena Blackwood stood in front of the bathroom mirror in her hotel room, 3 miles from Fort Stevens, California, and traced the scar on her left shoulder with her fingertips. The tissue was raised and angry, a pale ridge against her skin that twisted from her collarbone to her shoulder blade. She could still feel where each piece of shrapnel had entered, could map the constellation of wounds like a combat astronomer reading the stars. She had 48 hours before her official assumption of command. 48 hours to assess the climate at Fort Stevens, to understand what kind of organization she was inheriting, to identify the problems that official reports always glossed over with bureaucratic language and plausible deniability. The Pentagon had been very clear about her mission, even if they'd couched it in diplomatic terms. Fort Stevens had a reputation: multiple harassment complaints in 2 years, a command climate survey that made senior leadership wince, a culture of toxic masculinity that the Army could no longer afford to ignore, not in an era when congressional committees demanded accountability and social media turned every scandal into a national crisis. Elena had accepted the assignment anyway, not because she was naive about Pentagon politics, but because women had filed complaints and received nothing except transfers and whispered warnings about being difficult. Because somewhere at Fort Stevens there were junior officers wondering if speaking up would end their careers before they began. Because General Margaret Whitmore had called her 3 months before her death and said, "Elena, this is the mission that matters. This is where you prove that change is possible." General Whitmore, the legendary 4-star who'd served in multiple combat zones, who'd been the first woman to command a division in combat, who'd been Elena's mentor advocate and occasionally her conscience when ambition threatened to override principle, who died 2 months ago from pancreatic cancer, taking with her 47 years of wisdom and leaving behind a sealed letter that Elena had only opened last week. The letter sat on the hotel nightstand, now the paper worn from multiple readings. Elena picked it up one more time, her eyes tracking over the familiar handwriting. "Elena, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you're about to face the hardest command decision of your career. Fort Stevens is broken. I've known it for 15 years, but I lacked the courage to fix it when I had the chance. I chose ambition over justice. I chose my 4th star over protecting the women who needed me most. Don't make my mistake. There's a colonel at the Pentagon named Preston Vance. He's protected predators for decades because they're his friends, his mentors, his tribe. I documented everything but never acted on it. The evidence is in the hands of Colonel Nathaniel Garrison at Fort Stevens. He's been waiting for someone with the authority and the courage to finish what I couldn't start. Do this for the women I failed. Do this for yourself. And do this for your father who taught us both that honor isn't convenient. It's choosing right when it costs you everything. With respect and regret, Margaret Whitmore." Elena folded the letter carefully and tucked it back into the envelope. Her father, Colonel James Blackwood, killed in the 9 Gulf War when she was barely 5 years old. She had only fragments of memory. His laugh, the smell of his uniform, the way he'd toss her in the air until she shrieked with delight. But she had his letters, dozens of them written from Kuwait and Saudi Arabia in the months before his death. One letter, in particular, she'd memorized years ago, the one where he wrote about honor being more than comfortable words, about standing up when others won't, about being willing to pay the price that leadership demands. He'd hoped she'd never face that test. But if she did, he hoped she'd pass it. She'd passed a lot of tests since then. Ranger school, combat deployments, command positions, the scrutiny that came with being a woman in a profession that still wasn't sure women belonged. But this felt different. This felt personal, in a way that tactical decisions never were. Elena checked her watch. 6:15 in the morning. The promotion ceremony at Fort Stevens started at 10:00 hours. She had time for breakfast, time to drive to the base, and time to observe the organization when nobody knew she was watching. Time to see what Fort Stevens really looked like. when the general wasn't in the room. She dressed carefully in her service uniform, the navy blue jacket with its single star on each shoulder, concealed by a windbreaker she'd borrowed from a friend. The ribbons on her chest told their own story, but nobody would see them until she chose to reveal herself. For now, she was just another officer attending a ceremony, anonymous, unremarkable, watching. The drive to Fort Stevens took 20 minutes through morning traffic. The base sat in the Central Valley, surrounded by farmland and mountain ranges that turned purple in the distance. It was beautiful in a spare utilitarian way, the kind of landscape that looked deceptively peaceful, until you remembered that thousands of soldiers trained here for deployments to places where beauty was measured in survival rather than scenery. Elena parked in the visitor's lot and walked toward the officers' club, her stride purposeful but unhurried. Already, she was cataloging details. The base looked well-maintained, grass-trimmed buildings, painted vehicles in good repair. But physical infrastructure was easy. Culture was harder. Culture was invisible until you knew how to look for it. The Officers' Club was a 2-story building with white columns and a manicured lawn, the kind of structure that screamed tradition and ceremony. Elena could hear the brass band tuning up inside, the discordant notes of trumpets and trombones finding their pitch. Officers and their families were arriving in clusters, dress uniforms pressed to razor creases, shoes polished to mirrors, the whole pageantry of military formality on display. She slipped inside and found a position near the back of the hall, close enough to observe but far enough to avoid drawing attention. The room was filling up fast, maybe 200 people, possibly more. A stage dominated the front, decorated with American flags and unit colors. Rows of chairs faced the stage, already half filled with attendees. And there, near the refreshment table, stood a man who immediately caught Elena's attention. Captain Garrett Aldridge. She recognized him from his service photo, though the picture didn't capture the bitterness etched into his face or the slight unsteadiness in his posture that suggested he'd already been drinking. He was 42 years old, according to his file, with 18 years of service and a combat record that would have made most officers proud. A former ranger who'd earned his reputation through sweat and blood and the kind of courage that couldn't be faked. But somewhere along the way, Garrett Aldridge had curdled. 3 times passed over for promotion, a marriage falling apart, a daughter who wouldn't speak to him, and a resentment that had metastasized into something uglier, a belief that the Army had abandoned its meritocracy in favor of political correctness, that women were being promoted to fill quotas, rather than because they'd earned it, that the standards he'd met were being lowered for people who didn't deserve to wear the uniform. Elena had read his personnel file on the flight to California. She'd read the formal complaints that junior officers had filed and then withdrawn. She'd read the informal reports from NCOs who'd witnessed his behavior, but lacked the rank to challenge it. Most damning of all, she'd read General Whitmore's personal assessment that Aldridge represented everything wrong with military culture, not because he was uniquely terrible, but because he was exactly average. Men who confused personal disappointment with institutional failure. Men who blamed diversity for their own shortcomings. Elena watched Aldridge drain his 3rd glass of champagne and reach for a 4th. His friend Major Bryce Donnelly, another name from the files, laughed at something Aldridge said, their heads close together in the conspiratorial way that men have when they think nobody important is listening. Then Aldridge's eyes found her. Elena saw the calculation happen in real time, the way his gaze traveled from her face to her uniform, lingering on the absence of visible rank insignia. The way he nudged Donnelly and said something that made them both smirk. The way he straightened up and started walking toward her with the confident swagger of a man who'd already decided she was beneath his notice. This was the moment. This was what she'd come here to observe, not the official ceremony or the polished speeches, but the raw, unfiltered culture that existed when people thought nobody was watching. The microaggressions and casual disrespect that added up to a hostile environment. The 1,000 small cuts that drove talented officers out of the service. Aldridge stopped 3 feet away, close enough that she could smell the alcohol on his breath. His eyes were slightly unfocused. His smile the kind of condescending smirk that made Elena's jaw tighten, despite years of practice controlling her reactions. "You look lost, sweetheart," he said, his voice loud enough to carry to nearby conversations. Several officers turned their expressions, ranging from curiosity to discomfort. "Junior officers are supposed to sit over there. Or maybe you're hoping to meet someone important. Network your way up the ladder." Elena met his eyes without flinching. Her voice was calm, almost pleasant, with an edge of steel that most people missed until it was too late. "I'm exactly where I need to be, Captain." The use of his rank made Aldridge blink. He glanced down at his uniform, confirming that his captain's bars were visible then back at her face. The smirk widened. "Smart girl. Did your homework on who matters around here? That's good. Shows initiative. But here's a tip. The way to get ahead isn't by crashing ceremonies where you don't belong. It's by earning your place through competence, not connections." His hand reached out toward her arm, the gesture somewhere between patronizing and aggressive. "Let me help you find where you're supposed to—" He never completed the sentence. A hand shot out from behind Aldridge and gripped his wrist with enough force that his fingers splayed involuntarily. The hand belonged to Colonel Nathaniel Garrison, who'd moved with a speed that belied his 68 years and the slight stiffness that came from 4 decades of hard service. Garrison's face was pale with controlled fury, his jaw clenched so tight that tendons stood out on his neck. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut through the ambient noise like a blade through silk. "Captain Aldridge, step back, now." The room had gone silent. 200 conversations died mid-sentence as every person in the officers' club turned to watch the confrontation unfolding near the refreshment table. Elena could feel the weight of their attention, the collective held breath of an organization watching to see how this would play out. Aldridge tried to pull his wrist free, but Garrison's grip was iron. Confusion flickered across the captain's face, mixing with alcohol and wounded pride. "Sir, I was just being friendly. She's obviously lost, and I was trying to help her find—" "Stop talking." Garrison's voice was still quiet, but now it carried a note of command that made junior officers automatically straighten their postures. "Every word out of your mouth is digging you deeper. Stop talking." He released Aldridge's wrist and stepped between him and Elena, his body language protective and formal all at once. Then Colonel Nathaniel Garrison, veteran of the Gulf War, 44 years of service, commander of thousands of soldiers across multiple continents, did something that made the entire room gasp. He came to attention and rendered a salute so sharp, so crisp, that it could have been featured in a training manual. His right hand snapped to his forehead with parade ground precision, his heels locked together, his spine rigid with the discipline of 4 decades in uniform. Elena returned the salute with equal precision, allowing herself the smallest ghost of a smile. The silence in the room was absolute now. Not a cough, not a shuffle, not even the sound of breathing. Just 200 people frozen in place, trying to understand what they were witnessing. Garrison held his salute for another beat, then dropped his hand and turned to face Aldridge. When he spoke this time, his voice carried to every corner of the room. "Captain Garrett Aldridge, allow me to introduce Brigadier General Elena Blackwood." He paused, letting the rank register. "She is the incoming installation commander for Fort Stevens, arriving 48 hours ahead of schedule to conduct an unannounced assessment of our command climate. She currently outranks every officer in this room, including me. And you, Captain, just attempted to physically touch a general officer while intoxicated at an official ceremony." The color drained from Aldridge's face so fast that for a moment Elena thought he might actually faint. His eyes widened, his mouth opened and closed without sound, and his entire body swayed as if the ground had shifted beneath him. Behind him, Major Donnelly had gone equally pale, one hand reaching out to steady his friend before Aldridge's knees buckled entirely. Around the room, officers who'd been seated shot to their feet with varying degrees of coordination. Some rendered salutes. Others simply stood at attention, their faces reflecting shock embarrassment or carefully neutral professionalism. The junior officers looked stricken. The senior officers looked ill. Elena let the moment stretch, reading the room with the tactical awareness she'd honed in combat zones. This was information, pure, unfiltered data about who these people were when they thought nobody important was watching. Some of the officers near Aldridge had clearly overheard his earlier comments about women and quotas. Their expressions ranged from guilt to dawning horror as they realized a one-star general had heard every word. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was measured and calm, with the kind of quiet authority that didn't need volume to command attention. "At ease, everyone. Please sit down." The room obeyed with a rustle of fabric and scraping chairs. Elena kept her eyes on Aldridge, who was trembling now, the alcohol suddenly burned away by pure terror. She could see him trying to calculate the extent of his mistake, trying to find some angle that might minimize the damage, trying to remember if there was any possible excuse that wouldn't sound even worse than his actions. There wasn't. "Captain," Elena said softly, taking a single step closer to him. "I've been in the military for 15 years. I've served in multiple combat zones. I've commanded at every level, from platoon to brigade. I've earned every single rank through demonstrated competence, tactical excellence, and a willingness to bleed alongside the soldiers I've led. Not once did I sleep my way to a promotion. Not once did anyone hand me anything I didn't earn through performance that exceeded the standard, not just met it." She paused, letting each word land with deliberate weight. "I came to this ceremony in uniform, without my rank insignia visible, because I wanted to see how officers at Fort Stevens treat each other when they think no one important is watching. I wanted to understand if the values we claim to uphold, dignity, respect, professionalism, actually mean anything, or if they're just words we say during ceremonies while practicing something uglier behind closed doors." Tears were streaming down Aldridge's face now. Not theatrical crying, but the involuntary response of a man watching his career disintegrate in real time. His shoulders shook. His breath came in hitches. He knew exactly what was coming. A court-martial, probably. Conduct unbecoming. Assault on a superior officer. Dereliction of duty. A litany of charges that would strip him of his rank, his benefits, everything he'd spent 18 years building. But Elena wasn't finished. "Colonel Garrison," she said, her voice still calm, but now carrying a note of authority that made everyone in the room lean forward slightly. "I'd like to speak with Captain Aldridge privately after this ceremony concludes. In the meantime, let's continue with the promotions. These officers have earned their moment, and I won't let one man's mistake ruin their celebration." The murmur that ran through the crowd was almost audible, a collective exhalation of shock, mixed with something that might have been hope. Elena had just declined to immediately destroy Aldridge. She'd given him something that military justice rarely offered, a chance to face his mistake before the hammer fell. Garrison's expression flickered with something that might have been approval before he schooled his features back to professional neutrality. "Yes, ma'am. Captain Aldridge, you will remain in this room, but you will not participate further in this ceremony. Is that clear?" "Yes, sir." Aldridge's voice was barely a whisper. The ceremony continued, but the energy had changed fundamentally. Officers approached the stage to receive their promotions with a new awareness, their eyes occasionally flicking to where Elena stood at the back of the room. She watched them all, especially the junior officers, especially the women. Captain Kathleen Sullivan was 26 years old, rail thin, with a shock of red hair pulled into a regulation bun. She'd been an intelligence officer for 4 years, and according to her file, she was brilliant, the kind of analyst who could synthesize disparate data points into actionable intelligence that saved lives. She was also, according to the informal reports, one of the officers who'd filed a harassment complaint against Aldridge 2 years ago, and then withdrawn it after being told it would damage her career prospects. Elena watched Sullivan's face as Colonel Garrison pinned the major's oak leaves on her uniform. There was pride there, but also something harder, a wariness that came from years of proving herself while simultaneously dodging harassment. When Sullivan's eyes met Elena's across the room, something passed between them. Recognition, understanding, a silent acknowledgement that things might be about to change. Lieutenant Meredith Calloway was 29, a logistics officer with a reputation for solving impossible supply chain problems. She'd been at Fort Stevens for 8 months and had already identified 3 junior officers who made her uncomfortable with their comments and behavior. She hadn't filed formal complaints, not yet, but her private journal documented everything, just in case she ever needed evidence. Elena made a mental note to talk with both women, to hear their stories, to understand the gap between the official complaints and the reality that women navigated every day. The ceremony concluded 90 minutes later. Officers filed out in clusters, their conversations hushed and urgent. Elena could imagine what they were saying, speculation about her presence, anxiety about what she'd seen, relief or dread, depending on whether they had anything to hide. Aldridge remained in place, standing at parade rest near the back wall, his face still streaked with dried tears. He looked smaller, somehow diminished, not just by his mistake, but by the weight of consequences he could no longer avoid. Colonel Garrison approached Elena with the careful formality of a man who understood protocol down to his bones. "General Blackwood, my office is available whenever you're ready." "Thank you, Colonel. Give me 5 minutes to speak with some of the newly promoted officers. Then I'll meet you there." Garrison nodded and withdrew. Elena made her way through the thinning crowd, stopping to congratulate Sullivan and Calloway and 3 other officers who'd received promotions. She kept the conversations brief but personal, asking about their families, their career goals, their impressions of Fort Stevens. She was collecting data again, but this time she wanted them to know she was doing it. She wanted them to understand that their general gave a damn about more than just ceremonies and paperwork. Finally, she turned to where Aldridge still stood frozen in place, like a statue of military regret. "Captain, follow me." They walked through the officers' club in silence down a hallway decorated with plaques commemorating previous commanders and unit achievements. Garrison's office was at the end, a modest space with a desk, filing cabinets, and walls covered in photographs spanning 4 decades of service. There were pictures of Garrison as a young lieutenant, as a captain, as a major. Pictures of him with soldiers whose names Elena didn't know, but whose faces told stories of shared hardship and earned respect. And there on the far wall was a photograph that made Elena's breath catch in her throat. Her father, Colonel James Blackwood, 34 years younger than the day he died, standing beside a 20-something Nathaniel Garrison in front of an M1 Abrams tank somewhere in Kuwait. Both men were grinning, their uniforms stained with desert dust, their eyes bright with the confidence of soldiers who hadn't yet learned how fragile life could be. Garrison saw her looking and spoke quietly. "That was taken 3 weeks before the ground invasion. Your father and I served together in the same armored battalion. He was my company commander. The best officer I ever served under, bar none." Elena felt something tighten in her chest. She'd known Garrison had served with her father. It was in the files in the official records, but seeing the photograph made it real in a way that documents never could. These weren't just names on personnel reports. They were young men who'd trusted each other in combat, who'd shared dangers that turned strangers into brothers. "He saved my life during the Battle of 73 Easting," Garrison continued. "Our tank threw a track under fire. We were immobilized, taking hits from Iraqi T-72s. Your father maneuvered his tank between us, and the enemy drew their fire while we completed repairs. He took 3 rounds to his armor. Any one of them could have penetrated and killed his entire crew, but he stayed there until we were mobile again." Elena had heard versions of this story before, but never from someone who'd been there, never from someone whose life her father had saved. 2 days later, his tank hit a mine, Garrison said, his voice dropping. The explosion was catastrophic. There wasn't time to do anything. I'm sorry." "I was 5 years old," Elena said. "I barely remember him, but I have his letters. He wrote about you constantly, showed us pictures. He was so proud of you even then. Said you were going to do something important someday." Garrison paused. "General, he'd be proud of what you've become, and he'd be proud of what you're about to do here." Captain Aldridge had remained silent through this exchange, standing at attention near the door. Now, Garrison gestured for him to approach. "Sit down, Captain." Aldridge sat, his movements careful and controlled. His eyes were red, but dry now, his expression, a mixture of shame and resignation. He looked like a man preparing for execution, which in career terms he probably was. Elena took the chair across from him, while Garrison remained standing, a silent witness to what came next. "Captain Aldridge," Elena began, her voice neutral. "Do you understand the severity of what just happened?" "Yes, ma'am." His voice was hoarse. "Tell me what you understand." Aldridge swallowed hard. "I was drunk at an official ceremony. I harassed a superior officer. I attempted to physically touch a general. He faltered, his composure cracking. I destroyed my career, and I deserved it. Elena studied him for a long moment. She could end this right now. One phone call to the JAG office, and Aldridge would be facing a court-martial by the end of the week. It would send a message, a clear, unambiguous statement, that the culture at Fort Stevens was about to change. It would make her job easier in some ways, because everyone would understand that she was willing to drop the hammer without hesitation. But she thought about General Whitmore's words, about reaching people, about changing culture, one conversation at a time. "I'm not going to court-martial you, Captain," Elena said. The words hung in the air like a grenade with an uncertain timer. Aldridge's head snapped up, his eyes wide with disbelief. Even Garrison looked surprised, though he quickly schooled his expression back to neutrality. "Ma'am," Aldridge's voice was barely audible. "Instead, I'm assigning you to work directly in the Equal Opportunity Office for the next 12 months. You'll be detailed under Major Patricia Thornton, the EO Chief. You'll review every harassment and discrimination case that comes through this installation. You'll interview victims. You'll document patterns. You'll see firsthand the damage that attitudes like yours cause to real people with real careers and real families." Elena leaned forward slightly, her eyes locked on Aldridge's. At the end of those 12 months, one of two things will happen. Either you'll have demonstrated genuine change, a fundamental transformation in how you understand leadership and respect, and you'll be eligible for promotion to major. Or you'll resign with an honorable discharge because you'll have realized that you don't belong in this profession anymore. Why? The word burst out of Aldridge before he could stop himself. "Why are you giving me a chance after what I did?" Elena was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. 12 years ago, I was a lieutenant. I made a serious mistake, not like yours, but a mistake nonetheless. I cut corners on a safety protocol during a training exercise because I wanted to impress my commander. One of my soldiers was injured, not seriously, thank God, but seriously enough that it could have ended my career. She paused, the memory still sharp despite the years. General Margaret Whitmore was my division commander. She called me into her office, and I was certain I was finished. But instead of ending my career, she told me something I've never forgotten. She said the military isn't just about being perfect. It's about recognizing when you're wrong and having the courage to become better. She gave me a second chance. She mentored me. She showed me what real leadership looked like. Elena's voice hardened slightly. General Whitmore died 2 months ago. Before she died, she left me a letter about Fort Stevens. She specifically mentioned your name, Captain. She said you were a good soldier, broken by bitterness, and that you could be saved if someone was willing to try. She asked me to extend to you the same opportunity she once extended to me. Aldridge's face crumpled. Fresh tears tracked down his cheeks, but this time they weren't tears of fear. They were something deeper and more complicated. Shame, perhaps, or maybe the first stirrings of understanding that his worldview had been fundamentally wrong. I don't deserve this, he whispered. No, Elena agreed. You don't, but deserving isn't the point. The point is whether you have the courage to change, whether you can take this opportunity and transform yourself into the officer you should have been all along. That's the test, Captain. Not whether you deserve mercy, but what you do with it once you receive it. She stood, and both men immediately came to attention. Report to Major Thornton at 0800 Monday morning. Colonel Garrison will supervise your performance personally. If you have any questions or concerns, you will address them through the chain of command. Is that clear? Yes, ma'am. Crystal clear. Dismissed. Aldridge saluted properly this time, with precision and respect, and left the office. The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving Elena alone with Garrison. The old colonel studied her with an expression that mingled approval with concern. That was a hell of a gamble, General. I know. He might not change. He might waste this opportunity and prove that some people can't be redeemed. He might, Elena agreed, but General Whitmore believed he was worth the risk. And after 47 years of service, her judgment earned the benefit of doubt. Garrison nodded slowly. Your father used to say something similar. He said the measure of a commander isn't how they handle excellence. Any fool can promote the naturally talented. The measure is how they handle failure. Whether they have the wisdom to distinguish between someone who's failed temporarily and someone who's failed permanently. He walked to his desk and pulled out a manila folder thick with documents. General Whitmore asked me to give this to you. It's 15 years of documentation on Colonel Preston Vance and his protection network. Every case that was buried, every complaint that was ignored, every victim who was transferred to keep her quiet. She couldn't act on it herself without destroying her career before she made 4-star. But she wanted you to have it. Elena took the folder, feeling its weight. This was the real mission. Not the ceremony or the confrontation with Aldridge. Those were symptoms. This was the disease. Colonel Vance is scheduled to visit Fort Stevens next week for a routine inspection, Garrison said. Except it's not routine. He's coming to assess whether you're fit for command, whether you're the right kind of officer, by which he means the kind who'll look the other way when his friends engage in behavior that should end careers. Then I'll make sure to give him an accurate assessment of my fitness, Elena said. Colonel, I need you to do something for me. Anything, ma'am. I need you to stay past your retirement date. I know you've got 3 months left, but I need you here through the Vance investigation. I need your experience, your knowledge of the players, and your moral authority as someone who served 44 years with an unblemished record. Garrison smiled, and for a moment, Elena could see the young lieutenant from the photograph, full of energy and conviction, and the belief that the right thing always won eventually. General Whitmore asked me the same thing 3 months ago. I already submitted the paperwork to delay my retirement. I'll be here as long as you need me. Thank you, Colonel. No, ma'am, thank you. Your father would be very proud. Elena left Garrison's office and walked through the base, her mind already working through the tactical problem ahead. She had 12 months to transform the culture at Fort Stevens. 12 months to prove that change was possible. 12 months to honor General Whitmore's legacy and her father's memory. And she had one recovering alcoholic captain whose redemption might just prove that mercy and justice weren't opposites. They were partners in the long, difficult work of making broken systems whole. The sun was setting over the Central Valley, painting the mountains in shades of purple and gold. Elena stood in the parking lot and watched the light fade, one hand unconsciously touching the scar on her shoulder beneath her uniform. 48 hours ago, she'd been another officer with another assignment. Now, she was the commanding general of an installation with a broken culture, a pending investigation that could end multiple careers, including her own, and a mandate to prove that the Army's stated values were more than just words. But then again, she'd earned her rank in Kandahar, bleeding in the dirt while coordinating fire support and dragging Marines to safety. She'd stared down worse threats than Pentagon colonels and toxic organizational cultures, and she'd never backed down from a fight that mattered. Elena climbed into her car and drove back to the hotel, already planning her next moves. Monday morning, she'd officially assume command. She'd meet her staff. She'd begin the difficult work of assessment and transformation. But tonight, she'd read through General Whitmore's documentation on Colonel Vance. She'd study the patterns. She'd identify the vulnerabilities in his protection network. She'd prepare for the confrontation that would define her command and possibly her career. Because mercy was important. Redemption mattered. Second chances could transform lives. But justice, real justice for the women who'd filed complaints, and the dozens more who'd stayed silent, that was non-negotiable. And General Elena Blackwood had never failed a mission that mattered. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that California's Central Valley offered in early autumn. Elena stood on the parade ground at 0600, watching the sunrise pies paint Fort Stevens in shades of amber and gold. In 3 hours, she would officially assume command in a ceremony that would be recorded, photographed, and analyzed by everyone from the Pentagon to military blogs looking for any sign of weakness or hesitation. But first, she needed to understand what she was commanding. The base was already stirring to life around her. Morning PT formations jogged past in cadence, their voices carrying across the open ground. NCOs barked instructions at bleary-eyed privates. The smell of diesel fuel and fresh coffee mixed with the ever-present dust that infiltrated everything in this part of California. It was familiar and foreign all at once. The universal rhythm of military life played out in a location she'd only studied on maps and organizational charts. Colonel Garrison found her there, 2 cups of coffee in hand. He passed her one without comment, and they stood together in companionable silence, watching the base wake up. "Your father used to do this," Garrison said eventually. "Every morning before a mission, he'd find a quiet spot and just observe." Said it helped him think. Said the Army looked different in the early morning light, more honest somehow. Elena took a sip of coffee, letting the bitter heat ground her. "What am I not seeing, Colonel? What do the reports not tell me?" Garrison considered the question with the careful deliberation of a man who'd spent 4 decades learning when to speak and when to stay silent. "The reports tell you about complaints filed and statistics tracked. They tell you about programs implemented and training completed. What they don't tell you is how many women never file complaints because they've watched what happens to the ones who do. They don't tell you about the junior officers who turn down career-enhancing assignments because they can't stomach working for commanders who tolerate harassment. They don't tell you about the subtle ways that toxicity metastasizes, the jokes that aren't quite jokes, the evaluations that damn with faint praise, the network of protection that operates in the shadows. And Captain Aldridge, where does he fit in that ecosystem? He's a symptom, not the disease. A good soldier who got bitter and let that bitterness curdle into something uglier. But he's not systematically protecting predators. He's just broken in a way that's unfortunately common. Men who confuse their personal disappointment with institutional betrayal." Elena nodded slowly. She'd suspected as much from reading his file, but hearing it confirmed by someone who'd observed Aldridge over years added texture to her understanding. "And Colonel Vance?" Garrison's expression hardened. "Vance is different. He's not broken. He's calculating. He protects predators because they're his people, his network, his tribe, and he's very good at making problems disappear before they reach anyone with the authority to actually do something about them. Then we'll have to make sure this problem doesn't disappear." The assumption of command ceremony at 0900 was everything military tradition demanded, precise, formal, heavy with symbolism. Elena stood at attention while the Secretary of the Army's representative read the orders transferring authority. She accepted the installation colors from the outgoing commander, a competent but unremarkable colonel who'd kept the base running smoothly while carefully avoiding any controversy that might jeopardize his next assignment. Then it was her turn to speak. Elena had spent hours crafting her remarks, weighing every word for the multiple audiences who would hear them. The soldiers and officers assembled on the parade ground. The Pentagon officials watching via live stream. The media who would quote selected phrases in tomorrow's articles. But most importantly, the women who'd filed complaints and the unknown number who'd stayed silent. "I stand before you today as the 20th commander of Fort Stevens," she began, her voice carrying across the parade ground without amplification. "I carry that responsibility with profound respect for those who came before me, and deep commitment to those who will serve under my command. But I also stand before you as someone who has bled in combat, who has made mistakes and learned from them, who has been knocked down and gotten back up. I am not here to be perfect. I am here to demand excellence from myself first, and then from every person in this organization." She paused, letting her eyes sweep across the assembled formation. Excellence in combat operations. Excellence in training. Excellence in maintenance and logistics, and all the unglamorous work that makes military effectiveness possible. But also excellence in how we treat each other. Excellence in the dignity and respect we afford every soldier, regardless of their background or gender or rank. Because I can promise you this, I would rather command a smaller force that honors its values than a larger force that ignores them. The applause was polite, but measured. Elena hadn't expected enthusiasm. She'd expected what she got: acknowledgement that the new commander had spoken words that would now have to be matched with actions. Words were cheap. Leadership was expensive. After the ceremony, Elena convened her first staff meeting in the installation headquarters conference room. 15 senior officers sat around a mahogany table that had probably hosted similar meetings for decades. Most were colonels or lieutenant colonels with decades of experience. All were men, except for 2 Major Patricia Thornton from the Equal Opportunity Office and Lieutenant Colonel Rachel Morrison, the installation's Director of Public Works. Elena had reviewed each officer's file extensively. She knew their strengths, their weaknesses, their career trajectories, and their potential involvement in the toxic culture she'd been sent to fix. Now, she needed to see how they responded when challenged. Gentlemen, ladies, she began, standing at the head of the table rather than sitting. I've reviewed the command climate survey results from the past 2 years. The trends are concerning. Declining trust in leadership, increasing reports of unprofessional behavior, a perception gap between how senior leaders think the organization is performing and how junior personnel experience it. I want each of you to brief me on what you're doing in your specific area of responsibility to address these issues. Major Thornton, let's start with you. Thornton was 45, a compact woman with steel gray hair and the weathered expression of someone who'd spent years fighting battles that nobody else wanted to acknowledge. She stood and pulled up a PowerPoint presentation that was mercifully light on graphics and heavy on data. Ma'am, the Equal Opportunity Office has processed 47 formal complaints in the past 18 months. Of those, more than 20 involved allegations of sexual harassment or gender discrimination. 14 were resolved through administrative action, counseling, reprimands, or transfers. 9 were withdrawn by the complainants before investigation concluded. 4 remain under investigation. Why were 9 withdrawn? Elena's voice was neutral, but everyone in the room understood the implication. Thornton met her eyes steadily. The official reason in each case was that the complainant decided to handle the issue through informal channels or determined that the behavior had ceased. The unofficial reason, which I documented but had no authority to act upon, was that complainants faced retaliation pressure from peers or were advised by their chain of command that pursuing the complaint would harm their careers. The temperature in the room dropped several degrees. Several officers shifted uncomfortably. One colonel, a man named Harrington, who commanded the base's logistics battalion, spoke up. Ma'am, with respect, Major Thornton's characterization may be somewhat subjective. The Army has robust protections against retaliation. If complainants chose to withdraw, that was their decision. Elena turned her gaze to Harrington. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Colonel, in your experience, how many soldiers freely choose to harm their own careers? That's not what I meant, ma'am. Then what did you mean? Because it sounds like you're suggesting that 9 separate women, each with credible complaints, independently decided that protecting their harassers was preferable to pursuing justice. Does that seem statistically likely to you? Harrington had no good answer. Elena let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable, then turned back to Thornton. Continue, Major. The rest of the briefing was equally sobering. Thornton had documented patterns that anyone with eyes could see: certain units with disproportionate complaint rates, certain commanders whose subordinates consistently reported hostile work environments, certain NCOs whose names appeared in multiple investigations but never faced serious consequences. Major Thornton, Elena said, when the briefing concluded, you mentioned that you lacked authority to act on what you documented. That changes today. You now have direct access to me, bypassing the normal chain of command. If you identify patterns of retaliation or command failure, you report them directly to my office. Is that clear? Yes, ma'am. Thornton's expression suggested she'd been waiting years to hear those words. Good. Now I want you to reopen every withdrawn complaint from the past 2 years. Contact each complainant personally, not through their chain of command, but directly. Give them the opportunity to resume their cases with the assurance that retaliation will be met with immediate and severe consequences. Can you do that? Absolutely, ma'am. Elena turned to address the rest of the staff. I want to be very clear about something. This installation will operate according to the values we claim to uphold, not the values that look good in briefings, but the values that govern how we actually treat people. If that creates friction with how things have been done historically, then history will change. Questions? There were no questions. Just the careful neutrality of officers trying to assess whether the new commander's words would translate to action or fade into the usual bureaucratic noise. The staff meeting concluded at 1100. Elena returned to her office to find Colonel Garrison waiting with a thick folder of additional documentation. Captain Garrett Aldridge stood beside him at attention, looking like a man who hadn't slept in 3 days. Captain Aldridge reported to Major Thornton at 0800 as ordered. Garrison said, Major Thornton asked me to relay that he was prompt, professional, and asked intelligent questions about the EO mission. She's cautiously optimistic. Elena studied Aldridge. The arrogance from the promotion ceremony was gone, replaced by something that looked like genuine humility. His uniform was immaculate, his bearing correct, but there was a hollowness around his eyes that suggested he was running on willpower and coffee. How was your first morning, Captain? Enlightening, ma'am? Aldridge's voice was hoarse. Major Thornton had me read case files, detailed accounts from victims. I... He stopped, struggling with words. I didn't realize. I thought complaints were exaggerated. I thought women were being oversensitive. But reading the actual statements, seeing the documentation, understanding the impact... He trailed off again. Understanding what, Captain? Understanding that I was part of the problem. That my behavior, my attitude, my willingness to dismiss complaints as political correctness, it all contributed to an environment where predators felt protected and victims felt abandoned. He met Elena's eyes directly. I was wrong, ma'am. Fundamentally, completely wrong. Elena nodded slowly. One morning of reading case files didn't constitute transformation, but it was a start. Major Thornton is reopening withdrawn complaints. You'll be assisting her with victim interviews. You'll hear their stories directly. You'll document what happened when they tried to report. And you'll compile a comprehensive analysis of systemic failures that allowed abuse to continue. Do you understand? Yes, ma'am. This won't be comfortable, Captain. You'll be confronting your own complicity. You'll see how your actions and inactions harmed real people with real careers. But if you can face that honestly, if you can transform that understanding into genuine change, then maybe General Whitmore's faith in you will prove justified. After Aldridge left, Garrison opened the folder he'd brought. Speaking of General Whitmore's faith, this is her complete documentation on Colonel Vance's protection network. 15 years of evidence. And General, you need to see this particular section. He pulled out a subfile marked with red classification stamps. Elena read through the contents, her expression darkening with each page. The pattern was clear and damning. Over 15 years, Colonel Preston Vance had systematically protected 8 different officers and NCOs from accountability for sexual harassment. The methods varied informal pressure on complainants to withdraw convenient transfers before investigations concluded fitness reports that omitted documented misconduct, recommendations for assignments that moved perpetrators away from their victims rather than punishing them. But one case stood out with particular clarity. Senior Master Sergeant Derek Cunningham had been accused by 8 different women over a 5-year span. Each time, the complaint had been resolved through administrative action that left Cunningham's career intact, while the accusers were transferred or encouraged to separate from the Army. And in each case, Colonel Vance had personally intervened, making phone calls, sending emails, leveraging his Pentagon connections to ensure that Cunningham faced no real consequences. Where is Cunningham now? Elena asked. Retired with full benefits last year. Honorable discharge commendation from Colonel Vance himself. He's working as a defense contractor at a facility in Virginia. And the 8 women who accused him, Garrison's jaw tightened. 3 separated from the Army before completing their initial service obligations. 2 are still serving, but in different career fields from their original specialties. They essentially had to start over to escape him. 1 filed a formal complaint with the Inspector General that was dismissed for lack of evidence. 1 attempted suicide and is currently on medical leave. 1 is Staff Sergeant Amelia Brennan, the case that Captain Aldridge read about this morning. Elena felt cold fury settling into her chest. Not the hot anger of immediate reaction, but the calculated determination that came from understanding the full scope of injustice. Colonel Vance is arriving Thursday for his inspection. I want a complete briefing package prepared, every case, every intervention, every victim impact statement. I want evidence that would stand up in a court-martial. And I want it ready by Wednesday evening. Yes, ma'am. But General, you need to understand what you're up against. Vance has protected these people for 15 years because they're his network. Taking him on means taking on everyone he's protected and everyone who's benefited from his patronage. That's not just one colonel. That's a faction of senior officers who'll close ranks to protect their own. I understand. Elena's voice was quiet, but absolute. And I'm doing it anyway. That evening, Elena sat in her quarters, reviewing the case files personally. Each one was a story of courage, betrayed women who'd reported misconduct through official channels and received nothing except professional retaliation and personal trauma. She received detailed statements describing harassment that ranged from crude comments to physical assault. She read documentation of how commanders had discouraged complaints, pressured victims to reconsider, or simply failed to investigate thoroughly. She read impact statements describing careers, derailed mental health, destroyed faith in the institution shattered. Her encrypted phone buzzed. Her fiancé calling from a deployed location she wasn't allowed to know. "Hey," she said, her voice rough with suppressed emotion. "Hey, yourself. How's the new command? Complicated, necessary, potentially career-ending." So, a typical Tuesday for Elena Blackwood. His voice carried warmth and understanding earned through his own years of difficult assignments. "You okay? I'm reading case files, women who reported harassment and got nothing except retaliation, and dozens more who never reported because they watched what happened to the ones who did. I'm so angry I can barely see straight." "Channel it. You're good at that. Turn anger into action." "I'm taking on a Pentagon colonel who's protected predators for 15 years. This isn't a tactical problem I can solve with superior firepower. This is politics and bureaucracy and all the things I'm worst at. No, this is leadership. And leadership is exactly what you're best at. You've never backed down from a fight that mattered. Don't start now." After they hung up, Elena returned to the files. But now she was reading with a different focus, not just documenting injustice, but identifying patterns that could be used as evidence. Emails that revealed Vance's direct involvement, fitness reports that he'd personally edited to remove negative information, transfer orders that he'd expedited to move perpetrators away from pending investigations, a paper trail of complicity that General Whitmore had meticulously documented over 15 years. Wednesday morning brought Elena's first real test of authority. She'd called a commander's meeting, every battalion and brigade commander on the installation, plus their command sergeants major. 28 senior leaders gathered in the auditorium, their expressions ranging from curiosity to calculation to barely concealed skepticism. Elena stood on the stage without notes or PowerPoint. She'd learned long ago that the most effective communication was direct eye contact and unvarnished truth. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to share some statistics with you. Fort Stevens has one of the highest rates of sexual harassment complaints per capita of any installation in the continental United States. We have a command climate survey that shows declining trust in leadership at every level below colonel. We have an attrition rate among female officers that's double the Army average. And we have a pattern of complaints being withdrawn or resolved administratively without addressing root causes." She paused, letting the words settle. Now, some of you might be thinking that these statistics reflect the current social climate, that complaints are up everywhere, that standards are being lowered, that political correctness has made command more difficult. If that's what you're thinking, I need you to reconsider your position. Because the statistics don't reflect social change. They reflect command failure. Your failure. My failure as the new installation commander. Our collective failure to live up to the oath we swore. The room was absolutely silent. Several commanders looked uncomfortable. A few looked defiant. Elena could read their body language like a tactical map, identifying who would be allies, who would be obstacles, and who was still calculating which direction to lean. Here's what's going to change effective immediately. First, every withdrawn complaint from the past 2 years will be reopened. Victims will be contacted directly by the EO office and given the opportunity to resume their cases with my personal assurance that retaliation will not be tolerated. Second, any commander whose unit has a disproportionate number of complaints will be subject to a climate assessment conducted by an outside team from division. Third, I will personally review every sexual harassment case that comes through this installation. Not delegated to staff, personally reviewed by me. Questions? A colonel in the third row raised his hand. Elena recognized him from the files. Colonel Marcus Webb, an infantry battalion commander with 22 years of service and a reputation for old-school discipline. "Ma'am, with respect, this sounds like we're guilty until proven innocent. My unit has had 3 complaints in the past year. Does that mean I'm automatically under investigation?" Colonel Webb, guilty and innocent are legal terms. I'm talking about leadership effectiveness. 3 complaints in 1 year doesn't automatically mean you're a bad commander. But it does mean I'm going to examine your unit climate to understand why soldiers in your battalion felt their concerns weren't being addressed through informal channels. If the assessment shows you've created a healthy environment and complaints reflect individual bad actors who you're dealing with appropriately, then we'll document that and move on. But if the assessment shows systemic issues, then we'll address them together. Is that fair? Webb considered for a moment, then nodded. Yes, ma'am, that's fair. Anyone else? Lieutenant Colonel Carson from the Logistics Battalion, the same officer who'd defended withdrawn complaints during the staff meeting, raised his hand. General, this seems like a significant investment of time and resources in a relatively small number of cases. Is this really the highest priority for the installation? Elena's expression didn't change, but her voice acquired an edge that made several people straighten in their seats. Colonel Carson, let me be very clear about something. One of my soldiers being harassed is not a small number. One victim being pressured to withdraw a complaint is not acceptable loss. And creating a command climate where soldiers trust their leadership is not a distraction from our mission. It is our mission. Because I can train tactical skills and logistics, coordination, and equipment maintenance. What I cannot do is lead soldiers who don't trust that their chain of command gives a damn about their welfare. So yes, this is the highest priority. Any other questions? There were no other questions. Thursday morning arrived with the kind of tension that precedes significant events. Colonel Preston Vance's visit was scheduled for 1000. Elena had spent the previous evening reviewing every page of General Whitmore's documentation, memorizing names and dates and patterns of intervention. She'd rehearsed the confrontation in her mind, playing through possible responses and counter-responses like a tactical problem. Now, she sat in her office with Colonel Garrison and Major Thornton, finalizing the briefing package that would either end Vance's career or her own. Last chance to reconsider, Garrison said quietly. Once we present this evidence, there's no walking it back. Vance will come after you with everything he's got. Pentagon connections, political allies, media contacts who owe him favors. This will get ugly, General. It's already ugly, Elena replied. We're just making it visible. Major Thornton, are all the victim statements compiled? Yes, ma'am. 8 statements from women who accused Cunningham, documentation of Vance's interventions in each case, and 3 statements from witnesses who observed him pressuring commanders to resolve complaints informally. Good. When Vance arrives, I want you both in the room. This isn't a private conversation. It's an official briefing on command climate issues. At 1000 precisely, Colonel Preston Vance arrived at Fort Stevens in a staff car flying a colonel's pennant. He was 55 years old with the kind of presence that came from decades of command and the absolute confidence of someone who'd never faced real consequences for his actions. His uniform was immaculate, his bearing perfect, his smile calculated to convey both friendliness and authority. Elena met him at the headquarters entrance with proper military courtesy. They exchanged salutes, and she escorted him to the main conference room where Garrison and Thornton were already waiting. Vance's smile faltered slightly when he saw Thornton. General Blackwood, I understood this was to be a private discussion about your transition to command. Plans changed, Colonel. Please have a seat. Vance sat, his posture still confident, but his eyes now calculating. He was reassessing the situation, trying to understand why the installation's equal opportunity chief was present for what should have been a routine commander's dialogue. Elena didn't waste time with pleasantries. Colonel Vance, I've been reviewing Fort Stevens' command climate as part of my transition. During that review, some concerning patterns emerged, patterns that involve your direct intervention in harassment investigations over a 15-year period. I'd like to give you the opportunity to address these concerns before I forward my findings to the Inspector General. The temperature in the room dropped to 20 degrees. Vance's confident expression froze, then carefully rearranged itself into polite confusion. General, I'm not sure what you're referring to. As a Pentagon staff officer, I occasionally provide guidance to installation commanders on complex personnel issues. That's part of my role in the G1 office. If some of that guidance involved harassment cases, it was only to ensure proper procedures were followed. Is that so? Elena opened the briefing folder and pulled out the first document, an email from Vance to a battalion commander at Fort Stevens from 3 years ago. She read aloud, Jim, regarding the Brennan situation, I strongly recommend resolving this informally. Cunningham is a good NCO with a strong record. We don't need another witch hunt over a personality conflict. Encourage Brennan to work through her chain of command or consider a transfer if she's uncomfortable. Colonel Vance, does that sound like guidance to ensure proper procedures were followed? Or does it sound like pressure to dismiss a credible complaint? Vance's face had gone carefully neutral. That email lacks context. I was simply suggesting options to resolve the situation at the lowest level possible. Let's discuss context then. Elena pulled out another document. This is Senior Master Sergeant Cunningham's evaluation from that period. The original draft, written by his raider, included a comment about concerns regarding professional relationships with female subordinates. But the final version, which was submitted to the promotion board, omitted that comment. The editing metadata shows that you personally revised this evaluation 2 days after sending that email. Can you explain why you removed information about professional conduct concerns from an NCO's permanent record? Vance's jaw tightened. General, I think you're overstepping. My personnel decisions are made within my authority and don't require justification to a general officer investigating systematic failures in the harassment reporting system. Elena's voice was still calm, but now it carried an edge of steel. Colonel, I have documentation of 8 separate cases where you intervened to protect Cunningham. 8 women who filed credible complaints and faced either transfers or pressure to withdraw. And I have similar patterns involving 7 other perpetrators over 15 years. This isn't about a single judgment call. This is about a systematic effort to shield predators from accountability. Major Thornton spoke up, her voice firm. Sir, I've personally interviewed 6 of the 8 women who accused Cunningham. They all described similar experiences, being told their complaints would hurt their careers, being encouraged to handle issues informally, being transferred to different units while Cunningham remained in place. And in every case, they identified you as the person who ultimately ensured their complaints went nowhere. This is outrageous. Vance said, his composure finally cracking. I've served this army for 33 years. I've commanded in combat. I've mentored hundreds of officers. And now I'm supposed to sit here while He stopped himself, but the unspoken word hung in the air like poison. Elena leaned forward slightly. While a what, Colonel? While a female general questions your judgment, while someone with the authority to hold you accountable finally does so, please finish your thought. Vance's face was red now, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair. General Blackwood, you're making powerful enemies. The people you're attacking are respected officers with decades of service. They have friends at the highest levels of the Pentagon. You continue down this path, and you'll find that your career has peaked. 1 star is impressive, but it's also easy to leave someone at that rank indefinitely if they prove to be difficult to work with. Is that a threat, Colonel? It's a reality check. You're young. You're talented. You have a bright future ahead of you, but only if you learn to pick your battles. Some fights aren't worth the cost. Elena stood, forcing Vance to stand as well out of military courtesy. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, but carried the weight of absolute conviction. Colonel Vance, General Margaret Whitmore spent 15 years documenting your protection network. She collected evidence but never acted on it because she feared destroying her career before reaching 4-star rank. On her deathbed, she asked me to finish what she couldn't start. She pulled out one final document, General Whitmore's handwritten letter addressed to the Army Inspector General, and signed 2 weeks before her death. This is General Whitmore's formal complaint. She documented everything. Names, dates, cases, your direct involvement. She sealed it and gave it to Colonel Garrison with instructions to deliver it if you ever tried to interfere with harassment investigations again. You arriving at Fort Stevens to assess whether I'm the right kind of officer qualifies as interference. Elena slid the letter across the table. I'm forwarding this to the IG today, along with my own investigation findings. You'll be contacted for an official interview. In the meantime, I'm recommending that you be placed on administrative leave pending the investigation's conclusion. You're dismissed, Colonel. Vance stared at the letter, his face cycling through rage, fear, and finally calculation. He was already thinking about damage control, about which allies he could call, about how to minimize the fallout. But Elena saw something else in his expression, the recognition that his protection network had finally encountered someone who couldn't be intimidated or bought off or quietly transferred, someone who was willing to pay the cost that leadership demanded. Vance left without another word. Garrison escorted him to his staff car and watched it drive away. When the colonel returned to the conference room, he found Elena standing by the window, her shoulders tense despite her outward calm. Hell of a morning, Garrison said. It's not over. He meant what he said about making enemies. By tomorrow, every senior officer who benefited from Vance's protection will know that I'm the one who ended his career. They'll close ranks. They'll look for mistakes I make. They'll wait for an opportunity to push back. Let them wait. You've got the evidence, you've got General Whitmore's credibility backing you, and you've got the moral high ground. That's a stronger position than they have. Elena turned from the window. Colonel, I need to ask you something. Why didn't you act on this years ago? You had access to the same evidence. You saw what Vance was doing. Why wait for me? Garrison was silent for a long moment, his expression troubled. Because I was afraid, General. I told myself I was collecting evidence, waiting for the right moment, building an ironclad case, but the truth is, I feared ending my career, losing my pension, becoming another cautionary tale about officers who challenged the wrong people. I put my own security above the welfare of soldiers who needed someone to fight for them. He met Elena's eyes directly. Your father wouldn't have hesitated. He would have acted 34 years ago. Consequences be damned. But you're exactly like him. You see injustice, and you can't help but fight it, even when fighting is stupid and dangerous and likely to ruin everything you've worked for. That's why General Whitmore chose you. That's why I'm proud to serve under your command. And that's why I know, whatever happens next, we made the right call. Before Elena could respond, Major Thornton's phone buzzed with an urgent message. She read it, her expression darkening. General, we have a problem. Captain Aldridge just contacted me from the EO office. He's been going through old case files and found something that connects directly to today's confrontation with Colonel Vance. He says you need to see it immediately. Elena and Garrison followed Thornton to the Equal Opportunity office, where Aldridge was waiting with a file that looked like it had been pulled from deep storage. His hands were shaking slightly as he passed it to Elena. Ma'am, this is a complaint from 2015. A lieutenant named Sarah Brennan, Amelia Brennan's sister, filed a harassment complaint against Senior Master Sergeant Cunningham. The complaint was withdrawn after 3 days, and Lieutenant Brennan resigned her commission 6 months later. But tucked in the back of the file, I found this. He pulled out a handwritten note on official Pentagon stationery. The handwriting was unmistakably Vance's, and the content made Elena's blood run cold. Jim Brennan needs to go. She's a troublemaker, and her sister is Army enlisted. We can't have a family of complainers poisoning unit climate. Recommend non-recommending her for promotion, and making her remaining time uncomfortable enough that she resigns. Once she's gone, the sister will get the message. This ends now. PV. Dear God, Garrison breathed. He didn't just protect Cunningham. He actively destroyed a victim's career as an example to others. Elena read the note 3 times, her hand steady, despite the rage building in her chest. This wasn't just enabling harassment. This was weaponizing command authority to silence victims and terrorize their families into submission. Major Thornton contacts Sarah Brennan immediately. I want her statement on record. Colonel Garrison, add this to the IG complaint. And Captain Aldridge, she turned to face him directly. You found this. You recognized its significance. You're starting to understand how deep this goes. Yes, ma'am, Aldridge said, his voice rough. And General, I think I owe Staff Sergeant Amelia Brennan a personal apology. Because when she first filed her complaint 2 years ago, I was the one who told her it would hurt her career to pursue it. I was part of the system that protected Cunningham and punished her. I need to own that. Elena nodded slowly. Set up the meeting through Major Thornton. But Aldridge, don't expect her to forgive you. Don't expect closure or absolution. You apologize because it's right, not because it makes you feel better. Understood? Yes, ma'am. Understood. That evening, Elena sat alone in her quarters, staring at General Whitmore's letter. Tomorrow, the Inspector General's office would begin their investigation. Colonel Vance would activate his network of allies and start fighting back. Pentagon officials would start asking uncomfortable questions about whether General Blackwood was the right officer for Fort Stevens, whether she understood the importance of unit cohesion, whether her aggressive approach to command climate issues was creating more problems than it solved. And Elena would face the same choice that General Whitmore had faced 15 years ago: back down and preserve her career, or push forward and risk everything. But sitting there in the quiet of her quarters, with her father's photograph on the desk and General Whitmore's letter in her hands, Elena realized it wasn't really a choice at all. Some fights were worth the cost. Some values were worth protecting, even when protection meant sacrifice. And some missions, the ones that actually mattered, were worth seeing through to the end, regardless of personal consequences. Elena picked up her phone and composed a message to her fiancé. Kicked the hornet's nest today. Might have ended my career. No regrets. I love you. His response came back 30 seconds later. You're exactly where you're supposed to be, doing exactly what needs to be done. I'm proud of you. Come home safe. Elena smiled, despite everything. Then she opened her laptop and began drafting her official report to the Inspector General, documenting 15 years of systematic failure with the kind of meticulous detail that would leave no room for bureaucratic evasion or political compromise. She wrote until midnight, fueled by coffee and conviction, and the memory of women who'd been brave enough to report harassment only to have their courage rewarded with betrayal. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, Elena Blackwood had honored General Whitmore's final mission and her father's legacy of choosing right when it cost everything. That would have to be enough. The crisis notification came at 03:30 on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Elena had forwarded her investigation findings to the Inspector General. She was already awake. Sleep had become elusive since the Vance confrontation, her mind refusing to settle even when her body demanded rest. The secure phone beside her bed lit up with the distinctive tone that meant operational emergency, rather than administrative inconvenience. General Blackwood, she answered, her voice steady, despite the adrenaline already flooding her system. Ma'am, this is the Pentagon Operations Center. We have a developing situation in northeastern Syria. Special Forces team under attack taking casualties, requesting immediate tactical support. CENTCOM has identified you as the subject matter expert on the region and the tactical situation. SecDef is requesting your immediate deployment to provide on-ground coordination. Elena was already pulling on her uniform, the phone cradled against her shoulder. What's the current status? 12 operators pinned down in a compound. Heavy small arms fire, possible vehicle-borne IED threat, air support inbound, but they need someone who knows the terrain and can coordinate multiple asset integration. You deployed to that sector in 2019, correct? Affirmative. I'll be wheels up within 2 hours. Send the full brief to my secure tablet. She hung up and immediately called Colonel Garrison. He answered on the second ring, his voice alert despite the hour. General, I'm deploying to Syria for 3 weeks, possibly longer. Emergency request from CENTCOM. Colonel, this is happening now 3 weeks into the Vance investigation. That timing is not coincidental. There was a pause on the other end while Garrison processed the implication. You think Vance orchestrated this, got you pulled away from Fort Stevens, right when the IG investigation is ramping up? I think it's a hell of a coincidence that the Pentagon suddenly needs my specific expertise in Syria the moment I become inconvenient here. But I also think 12 operators are genuinely in danger, and I'm qualified to help extract them. So regardless of the politics, I'm going. Understood, ma'am. What do you need from me? Keep the EO investigation moving forward. Major Thornton has full authority to continue victim interviews and evidence compilation. Captain Aldridge continues his work. In the EO office, I want daily reports on his progress. And Colonel, if Vance or any of his allies try to interfere with operations at Fort Stevens while I'm gone, you have my authorization to tell them to go to hell. You're the acting installation commander. That means something. Yes, ma'am. And General, come back in one piece. These operators need you, but so do we. Elena's deployment to Syria was a blur of military transport aircraft, tactical briefings, and the controlled chaos of combat operations. She arrived at a forward operating base 50 kilometers from the Syrian border. As dawn broke over the desert, painting the sand in shades of amber and blood, the situation was worse than the initial reports suggested. The Special Forces team wasn't just pinned down, they were surrounded by a numerically superior force, with access to heavy weapons and tactical coordination that suggested professional military training rather than typical insurgent operations. Intelligence indicated the attacking force included former Syrian military officers with extensive combat experience and a deep understanding of American tactics. Elena spent the first 6 hours on the ground, reviewing reconnaissance footage, communications intercepts, and terrain analysis. The compound where the operators were trapped was a former government facility, 3 buildings arranged in a U shape with limited cover and no easy extraction routes. Enemy forces had established positions on the high ground to the north and east with vehicle-mounted heavy machine guns covering the southern approach. The western route was technically open, but satellite imagery showed evidence of hastily laid minefields. It was a tactical nightmare wrapped in a time constraint. The operators had water and ammunition for maybe 36 hours. After that, they'd be overrun. Elena gathered the extraction team leadership in the operations center, a Marine Corps colonel named Briggs, who commanded the Quick Reaction Force, and an Air Force lieutenant colonel named Hammond, who controlled close air support assets, and a Navy commander named Torres, who coordinated the helicopter extraction package. Gentlemen, she began, spreading a detailed terrain map across the planning table. We have one opportunity to get this right. The enemy knows we're coming. They've positioned themselves specifically to counter a standard extraction. So, we're not going to give them standard. She traced routes on the map with precise movements that reflected hours of similar planning in similar situations. The northern approach is heavily defended, which is exactly where they expect us. The southern approach has vehicle-mounted weapons that will shred our helicopters. The eastern approach offers no cover and puts our forces in a kill zone. So we're going west through the minefield. Colonel Briggs looked skeptical. Ma'am, with respect, minefields tend to slow down extraction operations. They do, which is why we're not extracting through the minefield. We're creating a diversion there. Colonel Hammond, I need 2 A-10 Warthogs to conduct a gun run on the western perimeter. Low, slow, and loud. The enemy will assume we're clearing mines for a ground assault from that direction and shift forces to counter. She moved her finger to the northern approach. While they're repositioning, we insert the Marine QRF. Here, using the high ground they've abandoned. Fast ropes from MH-60's suppressive fire from Apache gunships overwhelming force at the point of contact. We hold that position for exactly 12 minutes, while the trapped operators move to the extraction point here. She indicated a small depression in the terrain 300 meters from their current location. The operators move under cover of smoke and the chaos we're creating up north. Once they reach the depression, we extract them via MH-47 Chinook larger bird, more stable platform, can handle hot LZ better than the Blackhawks. The Marines hold for another 5 minutes to ensure clean extraction. Then they extract via their original birds. Total operation time, 17 minutes from first shot to last bird wheels up. Commander Torres studied the plan carefully. That's tight timing, General. A lot of moving parts that all have to work perfectly. No plan survives first contact, Elena acknowledged. But this plan gives us the best probability of success given the constraints we're working with. The key is coordination. Every element has to hit their mark within 30-second windows. Colonel Hammond, what's your confidence level on the A-10 gun runs? Hi, ma'am. Those pilots are some of the best in the Air Force. They'll put 30mm rounds exactly where you need them. Colonel Briggs, your Marines ready for a hot insertion? Ma'am, my Marines were born ready. Give us the word, and we'll make it happen. They launched the operation at 1400 hours local time. Elena coordinated from the operations center, monitoring feeds from multiple aircraft and ground units simultaneously. Her voice was calm and precise as she walked each element through their portions of the plan, making real-time adjustments as the situation developed. The A-10s made their gun runs with devastating precision, their cannons tearing through enemy positions on the western perimeter. Just as Elena had predicted, enemy forces began repositioning to counter what they assumed was the primary assault axis. Viper flight, you're clear for insertion, Elena transmitted to the Marine Blackhawks. Hostile forces moving away from your LZ. Window is open, execute now. The helicopters came in fast and low. Apache gunships leading with suppressive fire that forced enemy heads down. Marines fast roped into position with the kind of practiced efficiency that came from hundreds of training iterations. Within 90 seconds, they'd established a defensive perimeter and were engaging enemy forces that were still scrambling to respond to the unexpected northern insertion. Venom 1 Viper 6 has position, came the Marine commander's voice over the radio, pushing to phase line red. Copy Viper 6. Venom elements begin movement to extraction point. You have 12 minutes. Elena watched the feeds with the focused intensity of someone who understood that 12 American lives depended on the next 12 minutes going exactly right. The Special Forces operators moved through the chaos with professional competence, using the terrain and smoke for cover as they bounded toward the extraction depression. That's when the operation started falling apart. Viper 6 contact rear. We've got vehicles approaching from the south. Looks like technicals with heavy weapons. Elena's mind raced through the tactical problem. The intelligence hadn't shown mobile reserves in that sector. Either the enemy had reinforced faster than expected, or they'd held back assets specifically for this kind of scenario. Viper 6. How many vehicles? Count 3, wait 4. They're moving to cut off the extraction point. Elena made the decision in 3 seconds. All elements, this is Venom 1. We're accelerating the timeline. Venom team move to extraction point, immediately break contact and run. Viper 6, hold your position and engage those vehicles with everything you've got. Guardian 2. I need those Apaches on the technical vehicles now. Guardian 2 copies engaging. The Apache gunships pivoted and raced toward the approaching vehicles, their Hellfire missiles already locked on target. Elena watched the feeds as 2 missiles streaked downrange and impacted with devastating effect. 2 vehicles erupted in flames, but the other 2 kept coming, their heavy machine guns now firing toward the depression, where the operators were trying to reach safety. Venom 1, we're taking fire at the extraction point. The voice was strained, overlaid with the sound of bullets impacting nearby. We've got 2 wounded, need immediate medevac. Elena's jaw tightened. Wounded changed everything. It meant the extraction would take longer. The operators would be more vulnerable, and the window for success was rapidly closing. Big Bird 1, what's your position? She called to the Chinook helicopter. Big Bird 1 is 3 minutes out. Accelerate to best speed. We have wounded, and the LZ is hot. Elena switched frequencies. Guardian 2, I need you to prioritize those remaining vehicles. Danger close to friendly forces is authorized. Guardian 2 copies danger close. Engaging now. The Apache's cannon opened up, walking 30mm rounds across the desert toward the remaining technical vehicles. One vehicle exploded as rounds found the fuel tank. The other swerved wildly but kept advancing. Then Elena heard the transmission that made her blood run cold. Venom 1, this is Venom 6. I'm hit. Leg and shoulder. Can't make it to the bird. Elena recognized that call sign, the Special Forces team leader. A decorated officer with multiple combat tours and a reputation for never leaving anyone behind. Now, he was wounded and immobile in a hot landing zone, with enemy forces closing from multiple directions. The tactical calculus was brutal and simple. They could try to recover the team leader and risk the entire extraction package getting shot down. Or they could extract the mobile operators and come back later. Except later might mean finding his body, rather than bringing him home alive. Elena made the decision that would either save lives or haunt her forever. All elements stand by. She switched to the frequency she knew the team leader would be monitoring. Venom 6, this is General Blackwood. I need you to stay exactly where you are. Do not attempt to move. Help is coming. She looked at Colonel Briggs across the operations center. Colonel, I need a volunteer team to move on foot to Venom 6's position and carry him to extraction. 2 Marines, best you've got. This is extremely dangerous, and I won't order anyone to do it. Briggs didn't hesitate. Ma'am, you'll have volunteers. Every one of my Marines would run through hell for a fallen operator. Within 60 seconds, 2 Marine sergeants were moving toward the team leader's position under covering fire from their squad mates. Elena watched their progress on the drone feed, her hands gripped tight on the edge of the planning table. The sergeants moved with impressive speed despite the fire coming from multiple directions, using every scrap of cover the terrain offered. They reached the wounded operator and immediately began providing first aid while simultaneously preparing to move him. One sergeant fashioned a hasty sling from his own equipment. The other laid down suppressive fire toward the nearest enemy position. Big Bird 1, what's your position now? 30 seconds out. Copy. Be advised, LZ is extremely hot. You're going to take fire. Can you handle it? Ma'am, I didn't fly all the way to Syria to turn around at the last second. We're coming in. The Chinook appeared over the ridgeline, its twin rotors churning the desert air into a maelstrom of dust and debris. Enemy tracers arced toward it, but the pilots held their course with the kind of courage that metals couldn't adequately recognize. The helicopter flared over the depression, its rear ramp already lowering. The operators and the 2 Marine sergeants carrying their wounded teammate rushed aboard, moving with desperate speed. The crew chief was already reaching out to pull wounded aboard before the helicopter had fully settled. Big Bird 1 is taking hits. The pilot's voice cracked through the radio. We're leaking fuel. Recommend immediate extraction for all elements. Negative, Elena responded immediately. Get those operators out now. Viper elements will extract on their original birds. Ma'am, if we don't leave now, we might not leave at all. I said get them out. That's an order. The Chinook lifted off its engines, straining hydraulic fluid streaming from damaged systems. For 5 eternal seconds, Elena thought it might not make it. The helicopter seemed to hang in the air, struggling against damage and physics, and the desperate hope of everyone watching. Then it gained altitude and banked hard towards safety, the Apache gunships flanking it like guardian angels. The Marine extraction went smoother. Their Black Hawks swept in, recovered their people, and disappeared over the horizon before enemy forces could effectively respond. The entire operation, from first shot to last bird leaving the area, took 19 minutes. 2 minutes longer than planned, but with all personnel recovered alive. Elena allowed herself exactly 10 seconds of relief before switching back to command mode. Get me a full damage assessment on Big Bird 1. I want to know if they're going to make it to the FOB or if we need to stage an emergency landing. The Chinook made it barely. It set down at the forward operating base with failing engines and emergency systems screaming. But every operator aboard walked off under their own power, except the team leader, who was carried to the medical facility where surgeons were already standing by. Elena visited him 6 hours later, after the surgeries were complete, and he'd been stabilized. He was pale and hooked to multiple IVs, but his eyes were clear when she entered the recovery room. General, he said, his voice weak, but carrying a trace of humor. Thanks for not leaving my ass in Syria. Couldn't let the paperwork pile up if you didn't come back to sign it, Elena replied. How are you feeling? Like I got shot, ma'am, but alive, which is better than the alternative. I heard what you did. Heard you made the call to send Marines on foot to get me when the smart tactical decision was to extract everyone else and write me off. There are no acceptable losses. We bring everyone home, or we don't deserve to lead. He was quiet for a moment. Ma'am, I also heard that your deployment here was politically convenient for some people back home, that there are folks at the Pentagon who wanted you somewhere other than Fort Stevens while investigations were ongoing. Where'd you hear that? Special Forces Community Talks, General? We hear things, and we remember who stands up for soldiers when it's hard. You've got friends you don't even know about, people who'll have your back when this gets messy. Elena felt something tighten in her chest. Gratitude mixed with the humbling recognition that she wasn't fighting alone. Focus on recovering. Your team needs you operational. Yes, ma'am. And General, don't let the bastards grind you down. What you're doing at Fort Stevens matters. Matters more than tactical operations or political considerations. You're fighting for soldiers who don't have anyone else willing to fight for them. That's worth whatever they throw at you. During the return convoy to the airfield for her flight home, Elena's vehicle was third in line when an improvised explosive device detonated beneath the lead Humvee. The blast flipped the vehicle and sent shrapnel tearing through the convoy. Elena felt the familiar burning sensation as metal fragments struck her left shoulder, the same shoulder that had been wounded 7 years earlier in Kandahar. The old scar tissue tore open, blood soaking through her uniform as the convoy accelerated through the kill zone. She refused immediate evacuation, insisting on coordinating the casualty response and securing the wounded from the lead vehicle first. By the time she allowed the medics to examine her, she'd lost enough blood to require an emergency transfusion at the FOB before being cleared to fly home. Elena returned to Fort Stevens 18 days after deploying to Syria. Her left arm was in a sling, her shoulder heavily bandaged beneath her uniform. The flight home had been long and uncomfortable, giving her far too much time to think about what she was returning to. Colonel Garrison met her at the airfield with an expression that communicated everything before he said a word. It's bad, isn't it? Elena asked as they walked to his staff car. Colonel Vance arrived at Fort Stevens 3 days after you deployed. Showed up with authorization from the Deputy Chief of Staff G1. Claimed he was here to conduct a command climate assessment on behalf of the Pentagon. I told him to pound sand. He threatened to have me arrested for insubordination. I told him I was retiring in 8 weeks and he could go ahead and try. Despite everything, Elena smiled. How'd he respond to that? Turned purple, made some phone calls, then tried to go around me directly to the battalion commanders. I'd already briefed them that no one, and I mean no one, was to provide Vance with access to personnel files, EO case information, or victim statements without going through me first. Most of them followed orders. A few— Garrison's expression darkened. A few decided their loyalty to Vance outweighed their duty to you. Names: Colonel Carson from Logistics, Colonel Webb from Infantry, and Lieutenant Colonel Marsh from the Military Police Battalion. They gave Vance access to files, let him interview personnel without Major Thornton present, and generally undermined every safeguard we'd put in place. Elena felt cold fury settling in her gut. Where's Vance now? He left yesterday, but the damage is done. He's filed a counter-complaint with the Inspector General, alleging that you've conducted a politically motivated witch hunt, that you've created a hostile command climate for male officers, and that you've exceeded your authority in pursuing investigations against Pentagon staff. He's also claiming that your deployment to Syria was cut short due to medical issues related to previous combat injuries, and he's questioning your fitness for command. He's trying to flip the script, make me the problem instead of the solution. Exactly. In general, it's working. I've been getting calls from Division from Corps, from people at the Pentagon asking whether you're stable, whether the stress of command is affecting your judgment, whether Fort Stevens needs a different commander. They're building a narrative. Elena sat in the passenger seat, her wounded shoulder throbbing, her exhaustion threatening to overwhelm her. She'd spent 18 days in a combat zone, coordinating operations that saved lives. She'd taken shrapnel, defending American soldiers. And now, she was coming home to an ambush more dangerous than anything she'd faced in Syria. Where are we on the actual investigation? She asked, forcing her mind back to mission focus. Major Thornton has been exceptional. She's compiled victim statements from 17 women. She's documented patterns of retaliation in excruciating detail. She's built a case that should be absolutely ironclad. But 3 of the women have recanted their statements, said they were pressured by you and me to exaggerate complaints, said the whole investigation is politically motivated rather than justice-seeking. Let me guess, those 3 women were contacted by Vance or one of his allies. Almost certainly. We can't prove it because the contacts would have been unofficial. Phone calls that aren't recorded, conversations that never happened officially. But the timing is too convenient to be coincidental. Elena closed her eyes and leaned back against the headrest. This was the nightmare scenario she'd anticipated but hoped to avoid. Vance wasn't just defending himself. He was actively destroying her credibility, her command authority, and the investigation she'd built. What about Captain Aldridge? She asked. Please tell me he hasn't collapsed under pressure. Garrison's expression shifted to something that might have been respect. Aldridge has been remarkable, General. He spent the past 3 weeks interviewing victims, documenting cases, and compiling evidence. More importantly, he's been meeting personally with junior officers, both male and female, talking about what he learned, what he did wrong, how he's changed. He gave a voluntary briefing to company commanders about recognizing harassment and responding appropriately. Some of them dismissed him, but others listened, and I think he's starting to change minds. That's something, at least. They drove through the base in silence for several minutes. Elena watched Fort Stevens pass by soldiers conducting training vehicles, moving between facilities, the whole infrastructure of military readiness that continued regardless of leadership controversies. These were the people she was supposed to be protecting. These were the soldiers who depended on her to create an environment where excellence and integrity weren't contradictory values. Colonel, Elena said finally, I need you to set up a meeting for tomorrow morning. Everyone involved in this situation, Major Thornton, Captain Aldridge, the victim witnesses who are still supporting the investigation, and any battalion commanders who've remained loyal. I need to know exactly where we stand and what options we have left. Yes, ma'am. In general, for what it's worth, I think you're doing the right thing, even if it ends your career. Especially if it ends your career, because it means you are willing to sacrifice everything for what matters. Elena managed a tired smile. Tell me that after the hearing, Colonel. Then we'll see if we still think it was worth it. The meeting convened at 0700 in a secure conference room that had been swept for surveillance devices. 14 people gathered around the table, the core group that had supported Elena's investigation from the beginning. They looked tired, but determined like soldiers who'd been holding a defensive position against superior forces, and knew the final assault was coming. Major Thornton delivered the status briefing with characteristic precision. Ma'am, we currently have 17 solid victim statements that establish a pattern of harassment and systematic failure to address complaints. We have documentation showing Colonel Vance's direct involvement in pressuring victims and protecting perpetrators. We have email evidence, fitness report, modifications, transfer orders that show clear intent to retaliate against whistleblowers. She paused, and Elena could see the exhaustion in her eyes. But we also have 3 recantations that Vance will use to undermine the entire investigation. We have battalion commanders who violated your orders and provided Vance with ammunition to attack your leadership. And we have a Pentagon bureaucracy that's highly motivated to make this go away quietly rather than exposing systemic problems that implicate senior officers. Captain Aldridge spoke up, his voice carrying new confidence. Ma'am, I've been working with the junior officers who've been most affected by this culture. I think there's an option we haven't fully explored. These junior officers are willing to testify not just about specific harassment incidents, but about the broader culture of retaliation and intimidation. If we can get them in front of the IG investigators, if we can show that this isn't just about Colonel Vance, but about an institutional failure, then it becomes harder for the Pentagon to dismiss it as a personality conflict. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, the Public Works Director, nodded agreement. Captain Aldridge is right. I've spoken with several of my junior officers. They're scared, but they're also angry. They joined the Army because they believed in service and values. Watching those values get sacrificed for political expediency has radicalized them in a way that senior leadership needs to understand. Elena listened to the discussion flow around the table, her tactical mind processing options and probabilities. She could see the path forward, but it required risk that went beyond her own career. It required asking junior officers to put themselves in the line of fire, to risk retaliation, to bet their futures on the hope that justice would eventually prevail. Here's what we're going to do, she said, her voice cutting through the discussion with command authority. First, Major Thornton, I want you to contact the Inspector General's office directly. Request a formal hearing where all victim witnesses can testify in person, rather than just providing written statements. Make it clear that we're seeking sunlight rather than shadows. We want this investigated thoroughly and publicly. She turned to Aldridge. Captain, I want you to compile a comprehensive briefing on culture change efforts. Document what you've learned, how you've changed, what systemic failures enabled your previous behavior. This isn't about condemning yourself. It's about showing that change is possible when leadership actually commits to it. Yes, ma'am. Colonel Garrison, I need you to contact every battalion commander on this installation. Tell them I'm convening a commander's conference tomorrow at 1400 hours. Attendance is mandatory. Anyone who doesn't show up without a compelling operational reason will be relieved of command. Garrison smiled grimly. Going to be an interesting meeting, General. That's one word for it. Elena stood, forcing everyone else to stand as well. Look, I'm not going to lie to you. This situation is bad and probably getting worse. Colonel Vance has powerful allies. The Pentagon wants this to go away quietly. Some of you will face consequences for supporting this investigation. Maybe not immediately, but eventually. Promotions that don't happen, assignments that get delayed, fitness reports that are carefully worded to damn with faint praise. She paused, making eye contact with each person in the room. But here's what I know. Women filed complaints and got nothing except retaliation. Dozens more stayed silent because they watched what happened to the brave ones. And we have an opportunity, maybe the only opportunity we'll get, to prove that the Army's stated values actually mean something. That honor isn't just a word we say during ceremonies. That integrity matters even when it costs everything. Her voice dropped, but somehow became more intense. I'm seeing this through to the end, regardless of personal consequences. But I won't order any of you to follow me. This is a volunteer mission. Anyone who wants out, who wants to protect their career, who wants to step back from the firing line, I understand completely, and there will be no judgment. But I need to know now who's staying and who's going. No one moved. No one spoke. And in that silence, Elena had her answer. All right, then, she said quietly. Let's finish what General Whitmore started. Dismissed. The commander's conference the following afternoon was everything Elena expected and nothing she wanted. 28 battalion and brigade commanders packed into the auditorium, their expressions ranging from supportive to hostile to carefully neutral. Elena stood on the stage without notes or PowerPoint, just herself, and the weight of command authority that she might not hold much longer. "I'm going to be direct with you," she began. "Some of you supported my investigation into command climate issues. Some of you undermined it, and some of you tried to stay neutral and hoped the whole situation would resolve itself without requiring you to take a stand. I understand all three positions, even if I don't respect them equally." She let that sink in. But here's what's about to happen. The Inspector General is convening a formal hearing next week. Multiple victim witnesses will testify. Colonel Vance will be there. Pentagon officials will be watching. And the media will almost certainly get wind of it, because these things always leak. When that happens, every commander in this room will face a choice. You can support the investigation and risk being labeled as politically motivated. You can oppose it and risk being seen as protecting a corrupt system. Or you can try to stay neutral and risk being seen as cowards who won't take a stand when it matters. A colonel in the third row, someone Elena didn't recognize, raised his hand. "General, with respect, isn't this exactly the kind of divisive approach that's destroying unit cohesion? You're forcing people to choose sides rather than working toward consensus." Elena fixed him with a stare that had silenced mouthy lieutenants and recalcitrant contractors and occasionally hostile foreign military liaisons. "Colonel, unit cohesion, built on protecting predators and silencing victims, isn't cohesion, it's complicity. If this investigation destroys that kind of cohesion, then good. We'll build something better in its place." She turned to address the full room again. "I'm not asking you to like me. I'm not asking you to agree with every decision I've made. I'm asking you to stand up for the soldiers who don't have the rank or the connections or the institutional power to protect themselves. I'm asking you to be the leaders you claimed to be when you accepted command." The room was silent. Elena could read the body language some commanders, sitting forward with engagement, others leaning back with arms crossed in defensive postures, a few staring at the floor as if they could find answers in the auditorium carpet. "Last thing," Elena said. "I know some of you have been contacted by Colonel Vance or his allies. I know you've been asked to provide information that could be used against me. I know you've been promised that cooperation will be remembered when promotion boards meet. And I know that refusing cooperation has been framed as career suicide." She paused, and her voice dropped to something that was almost conversational, but carried the weight of absolute conviction. "Here's my promise to you. If this investigation ends my career, if I lose my star and get quietly reassigned to some Pentagon staff job where I can't cause trouble, I will still know that I did the right thing. I will still be able to look at myself in the mirror and know that I stood up when it mattered. And 20 years from now, when your grandchildren ask you what you did, when the Army's values were tested, you'll have to decide what story you want to tell them. Choose wisely." Dismissed. The hearing before the Inspector General began on a Monday morning in a Pentagon conference room that had hosted countless investigations over the decades. Elena sat at one table with Colonel Garrison and Major Thornton. Across the room, Colonel Vance sat with three lawyers and an expression of absolute confidence. Between them, a panel of 5 senior officers, 3 generals, and 2 colonels sat in judgment. The lead investigator, a 2-star general named Morrison, opened the proceedings with formal language about the investigation's scope and purpose. Then he turned to Elena. "General Blackwood, you've alleged that Colonel Vance systematically protected perpetrators of sexual harassment over a 15-year period. You've submitted extensive documentation to support these allegations. Colonel Vance has submitted a countercomplaint alleging that you've conducted a politically motivated investigation that has created a hostile command environment. We're here to determine which version of events is supported by evidence. Do you have an opening statement?" Elena stood. She'd spent weeks preparing for this moment, rehearsing arguments and refining language. But now, standing before these 5 officers who held her career in their hands, she spoke from the heart. "Sir, I don't have a version of events. I have evidence. I have victim statements. I have documentation of Colonel Vance's direct involvement in pressuring victims and protecting perpetrators. But more importantly, I have women who were brave enough to report harassment and were betrayed by the institution they served. This isn't about me or my command style, or whether I'm politically motivated. This is about whether the Army's stated values are real, or just convenient words we say when they don't cost us anything. She pulled out a folder and set it on the table. General Whitmore, a 4-star general, with 47 years of service, spent 15 years documenting these failures. She died believing she'd failed the women who needed her most. On her deathbed, she asked me to finish what she couldn't start. I'm here because I refused to fail them the same way. The hearing lasted 3 days. Victim after victim testified, describing harassment and retaliation in detail that made even the stone-faced panel members wince. Major Thornton presented documentation that created an undeniable pattern of institutional failure. Captain Aldridge gave testimony about his own transformation and what it revealed about the toxic culture that had enabled his behavior. Colonel Vance's defense was predictable but effective. He portrayed himself as a dedicated officer trying to handle complex personnel issues in a difficult environment. He suggested that complainants had exaggerated or mischaracterized normal military interactions. He framed Elena's investigation as the work of an inexperienced commander trying to make a name for herself by attacking senior officers. On the third day, the panel called Colonel Nathaniel Garrison to testify. The old colonel stood before them in his dress uniform, chest covered with ribbons from 4 decades of service. He'd officially retired 2 weeks earlier, which meant he no longer faced career consequences for speaking truth to power. That freedom showed in his testimony. "Gentlemen," he began, "I've served this Army since 1981. I've commanded in combat, I've mentored hundreds of officers, and I've watched good people destroyed by a culture that protects predators and punishes victims. Colonel Vance isn't an aberration. He's the logical result of a system that values institutional reputation over individual justice." He pulled out his own documentation, decades of notes and observations that he'd kept but never acted upon. "For 30 years, I told myself I was waiting for the right moment to act. The truth is, I was afraid. Afraid of losing my pension. Afraid of becoming a cautionary tale. Afraid of paying the price that moral courage demands." His voice strengthened. "General Blackwood's father saved my life in the Gulf War. He taught me that leadership means standing up when it's hard, when it's costly, when every rational calculation says to stay quiet. I failed to honor his example. But his daughter, she's exactly like him. She sees injustice and fights it even when fighting threatens everything she's worked for." Garrison looked directly at the panel. "You're about to make a decision that will define what this Army stands for. You can side with Colonel Vance and send a message that powerful officers are untouchable, that victims should stay silent, that institutional reputation matters more than individual justice. Or you can side with General Blackwood and prove that our values are more than words. Choose wisely, gentlemen, because soldiers are watching, and they'll remember what you decide." The panel deliberated for 6 hours. Elena waited in a conference room with Garrison and Thornton, drinking bad coffee and trying not to think about the dozen different ways her career could end in the next few minutes. When the panel finally called them back, General Morrison's expression was unreadable. "We've reviewed all testimony and documentation," he began. "We find that Colonel Vance did systematically intervene in harassment investigations in ways that violated policy and professional standards. We find that his interventions created an environment where victims faced retaliation and perpetrators faced inadequate consequences. We recommend that Colonel Vance be subject to disciplinary action, including forced retirement and loss of certain benefits." Elena felt something release in her chest. Vindication, mixed with exhaustion, and the bittersweet recognition that winning the investigation didn't undo the harm that had already occurred. But Morrison wasn't finished. "We also find that General Blackwood exercised appropriate command authority in pursuing this investigation. However, we note that her methods were at times aggressive, and that several officers under her command felt pressured or intimidated by the investigative process. We recommend that General Blackwood receive additional training on command climate management and that her fitness for continued command be reassessed after 6 months." The qualification hit like a punch to the gut. They'd vindicated the investigation, but questioned her leadership. They'd punished Vance, but suggested she'd overstepped. It was the bureaucratic equivalent of splitting the baby, giving both sides something while satisfying neither. Outside the Pentagon, Elena stood in the late afternoon sun with Garrison beside her. "They're going to use that recommendation to slow roll my career," she said quietly. 6-month reassessment means no promotion consideration for at least 2 years. Probably longer. My career trajectory just flatlined. Maybe, Garrison acknowledged. Or maybe you just proved that integrity matters more than trajectory. Not everyone gets to be a General Elena, but everyone gets to choose what kind of person they want to be. You chose right. 6 months later, Fort Stevens held another promotion ceremony. This time, it was Major Garrett Aldridge, not Captain, anymore receiving his oak leaves from General Elena Blackwood. He stood at attention while she pinned the rank on his uniform, and she could see the transformation that had occurred over the past year. The arrogance was gone, replaced by hard-won humility and genuine commitment to the values he'd once dismissed. "Congratulations, Major," Elena said. "You've earned this." "Thank you, ma'am, and General." He lowered his voice so only she could hear. "Thank you for not giving up on me when you had every reason to. Thank you for showing me that change is possible." The ceremony continued. Captain Kathleen Sullivan promoted to Major. Lieutenant Meredith Calloway promoted to Captain. And Staff Sergeant Amelia Brennan receiving the Army Commendation Medal for her courage in testifying despite retaliation. Her sister Sarah, who'd resigned her commission years earlier, stood in the audience with tears streaming down her face, invited back by Elena personally to witness justice finally served. After the ceremony, as people were filtering out a captain, Elena didn't immediately recognize approached Lieutenant Calloway with what looked like the beginning of an inappropriate comment. The room went silent, as everyone instinctively understood they were watching another test. Major Aldridge was there before Elena could move. "Captain Whitfield," he said, calmly but firmly, "that comment was inappropriate. You need to apologize to Lieutenant Calloway right now, or you need to leave this ceremony." Whitfield looked shocked. "It was just a joke. I used to make those jokes." Aldridge cut him off. "I was wrong then, and you're wrong now. You have 2 choices. Choose." Whitfield stammered an apology and left quickly. Aldridge turned to Calloway. "Ma'am, I apologize that you had to experience that. It won't happen again in any space I'm responsible for." Elena watched the exchange with something approaching satisfaction. This was what success looked like, not policy changes or official investigations, but individual officers choosing to hold each other accountable. Culture changing one interaction at a time. That evening, Elena sat in her quarters, reviewing her fitness report. The reassessment had come through satisfactory, but not outstanding. Adequate, but not exemplary. The kind of report that kept her employed, but ensured she'd never wear a second star. Her fiancé called now back from his own deployment. "Hey, how are you holding up?" "I'm never making general again," Elena said. "They'll keep me at 1 star until I retire. Fort Stevens will be my last command." "Does that bother you?" Elena thought about the question, really thought about it. A year ago, it would have devastated her. Career advancement had been the metric by which she measured success. But now, sitting in quarters at an installation where victim reports were actually being investigated and harassment was actually being punished, where junior officers felt safe coming forward and battalion commanders held each other accountable. "No," she said finally, "it doesn't bother me. Because women who filed complaints actually got justice. Because Captain Aldridge transformed from an enabler into an advocate. Because Colonel Vance lost his career and his reputation and his ability to protect predators. Because 17 women got to see their attackers held accountable, and Sarah Brennan got to witness her sister honored instead of punished. That's worth a second star. That's worth a lot more than a second star. Good, because I was going to marry you anyway, but I'm glad you figured out what actually matters." After they hung up, Elena walked through the base one last time. It was late evening, the California sky painted in shades of purple and gold. She could see soldiers conducting final checks, NCOs mentoring junior enlisted officers, reviewing plans for the next day. the whole rhythm of military life that continued regardless of any individual leader. She stopped at the memorial wall outside the headquarters building where plaques honored officers who'd commanded Fort Stevens over the decades. Her own plaque would join them someday. Brigadier General Elena Blackwood, 20th Installation Commander. It wouldn't mention the investigation, or the controversy, or the career that had flatlined. It would just be a name and dates of service. But somewhere in the files at Fort Stevens, there would be documentation of what she'd actually accomplished. Victim statements that had been heard and acted upon. A culture that had started changing. Junior officers who'd learned that speaking up was possible, that the system could work if leaders had the courage to make it work. And General Margaret Whitmore's letter, preserved in Elena's personal files, that had started everything. Elena had chosen right. She'd paid the cost. And she'd sleep well tonight knowing that honor wasn't just a word she said during ceremonies, it was a value she'd defended when it mattered most. The memorial wall would show her name. But the real legacy would be measured in soldiers who felt safe and victims who received justice and officers who learned that values were worth protecting, even when protection meant sacrifice. That was enough. That was more than enough. General Elena Blackwood walked back to her quarters, her career trajectory flatlined, but her conscience clear, ready to continue the long, difficult work of making broken systems whole. Some victories didn't come with promotions. Some successes didn't advance careers, but they mattered anyway. They mattered most of all.